I would like to thank you so much for your very interesting presentation. I was a little bit worried that my theme would be a little bit out of touch with our day's discussions, but listening to you, in my mind at least, I found many roads that our paths cross, actually. And even though we are in a very different century, I think this author, whose name this church we are now in draws its names from, Vídalínskirkju, is from Jón Vídalín, this bishop. And it's my belief that his contribution to the Icelandic theological and Christian tradition reflects in many ways the same ideas that you have been presenting to us. I would like to begin with the statement that Christianity is a tough culture. It's very hard to find stronger criticism towards the reigning theology and belief than we experience in the words and writings of leading Christian authors throughout the centuries. Probably the most influential criticism we read regarding these things comes from inside. Of course, notably and most famous and influential is the criticism Martin Luther brought from dividing the Western Roman Church into two sectors in the 16th century. But we can find many other examples of this, and the statement the reformists gave, Ecclesia semper reformanda est, that idea can be found and experienced in many contexts in the following centuries. And my thesis in this presentation here is that this best-selling author in Icelandic church history, Bishop Vídalín, was actually, can be seen as an example of a very important ideas contrary to the reigning theological currents at that time. And also, as is mentioned in my subtitle, that I will also especially focus on his ideas on judgment and Judgment Day, which in the Icelandic context has a little, maybe a different meaning than in many other countries, as we have all these volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. And I was thinking about it that Sigurður O Bishop, whose institution is sponsoring this event, he told this story once from his upbringing in southeastern Iceland. It was in the famous year 1918 when Iceland gained independence from Denmark, but also also was plagued by the Spanish flu, and it was the coldest winter in Iceland in centuries. And one morning, an Icelandic farmer's woman came out of her little cottage in southeastern Iceland, opened the door, and saw that the sky was black. And she was convinced that now that Judgment Day had arrived. But as she described it herself, then she realized to her terror that this was the volcano Katla, not Judgment Day. And she might have agreed with your opinion on Judgment Day that it's not that terrible, at least not as terrible as the volcano Katla, which is a terrible volcano. So, this is from the title of my presentation comes from this citation from this postil, this famous Icelandic bishop published. And I was so lucky that I wrote actually an article about this postil in a Scandinavian book called Påskpredikan í luthersk tradition, and I wrote it with much help from a friend of mine in Danish, and I used the opportunity to cite that. A sorrowful and shattered spirit is the English phrase, is the only sacrifice that pleases God. This is a very important statement in my opinion. Why? Because Christ's service works in such cases and not otherwise, because God does not want to impute sins committed to man. So this, in my mind, reflects the general ideas of the bishop, where he is very interested in the passionate, emotional state of the Christian mind, contrary to the earlier apostles, where the denominations and confessions were in the center. He takes the main weight from the structural confessions that the Lutheran Church had, contrary to other denominations and confessional sectors of the Church, and takes, on the other hand, his emphasis and puts his emphasis on the subjective state of mind of the Christian person. But first, just as we are discussing clashes between religious ideas, this was, of course, probably the worst example of such conflict, the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, with enormous casualties. And this terrible conflict, this terrible world war, as we can call it, because there were also conflicts in America, where the Europeans had established colonies, that opened the eyes for many for the darker side of the orthodoxy, which defined oneself contrary to other denominations. The end of this terrible war was the Treaty of Westphalen, where they restated this rule that was first put in words in the Peace of Augsburg, 1555, cuius regio eius religio, that the ruler of each area would decide which confessions would be ruling there. But this was also a precursor for religious tolerance in Europe, because they allowed people to practice their faith, despite that they were a minority in each country. This was also a very important thing, because in this treaty they established diplomatic methods for conflicts, for working on conflicts and dissolving problems between nations. So it was a general agreement, and from this we can say maybe that Europe, as it would later evolve, comes from these ideas that were presented in the Treaty of Westphalen. And the ideological result of these events was the Pietism, and that the 30 Years' War opened the eyes for many theologians about the terrible results that you can get from defining yourself contrary to what others believed. So they were criticizing the orthodoxy, the spiritless scholasticism, and all the restrictions that were placed in the churches, and they wanted a renewal of the spirit of the early Christianity as they experienced it. And instead of focusing on the churches that were defined by the borders of the state, as had been in the confessional era, they wanted to concentrate on the few pious religious people who were really living the life that their religious beliefs should reflect with words like rebirth and so on. These are the 6 proposals of the author, or the person who is usually claimed to have given Pietism its name. It's Philip Jakob Spener, who in the year 1675 published his paper Pia Desideria, and as we can see, this is quite different from the ideas of Orthodoxy, where honesty and devotion and all kinds of religious acts and religious mindset is put over being part of a certain state defining which sect which denomination people belong to. And the 6th part, which is important in this context, is the way pastors should preach, that they really wanted pastors to have influence on their church goers and the people who were listening to them, that their words would reflect, would have fruits in the works of the congregation. So this is the book that has been published in Iceland 15 times. The first copies came out in the year 1718 and the latter half 1720, and the last publication came in 1995. A very big and important book, and it should be somewhere here in this church. This draws its name from the author. And the reason why they gave this church its name is of course that Jón Vídalín, the author and the bishop, he was born in neighborhood of this church, Garðabæ, and was of this elite in Iceland. And it's quite interesting that there was young man of high status like he was, had more chances of studying in Denmark than was the case for Danish young men. There's a higher percentage of Icelandic young men who were allowed to go to Denmark and study in the University of Copenhagen. And that's where he studied. He became a magister and was usually after that called in the Icelandic Meistari Jón, which is Magister John. And this is the time his first popular. This is, for example, this shows the status that Jón Vídalín has had in Icelandic culture. This is his namesake, Jón Helgason, who was a bishop in Iceland the former half of the 20th century. And he compared him to John Chrysostomus' golden mouth, Gullinmunni, and he was so impressed of the text and the rhetorics that Jón Vídalín used in his postil. He filled them with all kinds of quotes from classical literature, and he concluded by saying that Jón Vídalín was the most Icelandic, teacher was not maybe the best translation, the most Icelandic author that Iceland has ever had, or a sermon. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to show you examples from this notorious book, this very popular Icelandic book that was read up loud in Icelandic farms and cottages when people could not go to church on Sundays or other holy days. And we can imagine that people had many occasions to open this postil because weather in Iceland can be quite difficult to travel. So people sat in there in the cottage, and one, usually the man of the farmer, he would open the book and read up loud from the postil for the other people in this family. Like I mentioned, Spener defined the church not according to the state, but according to those who are really pious and have a true, honest religion and live among the others. And here you can see, we can see in the first Sunday of Advent, where he says, beware Christian. This is a little bit of terror and freight in his words, that the King of Glory rides every day into his city, which is the Christian church, and he's a spiritual king. So his kingdom is spiritual, which is contrary to the orthodoxy idea where the church was defined according to the state where the king or the ruler was ruling. And so we have to renew our spirit every day. So this is a very dynamic understanding of the life of a Christian person. So I compared Jón Vídalín's postil to his predecessor, which was a pastor in northern Iceland, a bishop in northern Iceland, Skúli Sigurður Ólafsson, which can be seen as a good example of high orthodoxy. His postil was published first in 1665 and was not nearly as popular as Vídalín's postil was. So, what Skúli Sigurður Ólafsson says in his postil on the same occasion, he wants to educate the readers and the listeners to his words about the sacraments, which is not a big issue for the pietists, the Eucharist and the baptism, because their ideas are more subjective, and that we can see very clearly in Vídalín's postil. So, first is the baptism, and then he mentioned we got our salvation from the Eucharism. So it's quite stable. We are not in this dynamic subjective area as Jón Vídalín claims. When Jesus calms the storm, that famous evangelium, and then we can see that the boat where the Christians, where the disciples are in and very scared, as we know from that story, that's of course an allegory for the church in many later discussions about that story. And here we can see how Jón Vídalín describes the church. It's a small group of people belonging to Christ, and they must undergo all kinds of attacks. So they are few and they are chosen, and people are always trying to lay them astray, to make them go away from their honest beliefs and works. A very different view from Skúli Sigurður Ólafsson, who is on board. Well, the pastors, who are the servants of God's words, they are rowing the boat, and the pilgrims are the orthodox children of God. A very different view. Jón Vídalín, in his words, he actually wants to go away from the general idea that people who are baptized in the church are part of it. For him, it's a small percent of that group that really belongs to the church. So we have this classical biblical theme and the symbol for the church, Gísli is educating us. The servant presumably are the pastors. But Jón Vídalín, this is a very different view. It's not the institution of the church. It's just a small group that's living among the godless generations, which of course are people baptized into the Christian church. But in his mind, that's not sufficient. So he's breaking away from all these definitions about what it is to be a part of the Christian church. And on the second day, Sunday of Advent, and there we are getting closer to Judgment Day, which is actually not a big theme in this postil. But it's interesting that he is talking about, now we are just in Vídalín's postilla, in the postil of Jón Vídalín. So he is extinguishing the flames of this, all this lust and illicit love with the flood. And as love has grown cold, his emphasis is in this heart that is beating strongly and has this big warmth of love. And the coming of the great God and our Lord Jesus Christ will be terrible to all godless men. So we're not very different from the ideas of the Quran, as you have been citing here. And but why should God's children fear the last day? And they should not have fear the God's children, which is of course a very pietist phrase there. And on the fourth Sunday after Easter, we see here that St. James, he cites St. James, which Sigurður, our friend, wrote his PhD thesis about, and is not very much of a friend of Martin Luther, because his emphasis was much on the deeds of the Christians. And he claims here, Jón Vídalín, that it is not enough to confess your faith and your belief. If that's not enough, you have to live according to your creed. And as he said, the demons also believe it and are terrified according to St. James. So, in my opinion, Vídalín's postilla is Icelandic bestseller and probably one of the most influential books of Christendom that has been published and written in Icelandic. Gives us an example of harsh criticism towards the orthodoxy and the idea that Christians and religious groups should define themselves according to what they are not. Instead, Pietism finds all kinds of inspiration in different denominations. Jón Vídalín, for example, he translated a Puritan book, The Whole Duty of Man. His teachers in Copenhagen were personal friends of Spener. And they had strong ideas about how to preach in this spiritual and emotional manner. The political situation following the 30 Years' War paved way for more tolerance toward different confessional groups, as we can see in the treaties of Westphalen. And the postil goes away from the formal definitions and turns to what we can call pathos, or the passionate way to understand Christianity. So it's just a small group of people living in the sinful world, and people should be wholehearted and express their faith through strong emotions and good works, which is, of course, the main message from the Epistle of James, which was not a favorite epistle or a biblical citation for Luther and the Orthodox. So I would like to conclude the picture of this beautiful church And I find it very appropriate this discussion should be here, and I thank my friend Sigurður for inviting me here, and I'm looking forward to hearing more lectures about this very important and timely topic, which I think has deep roots in the Christian tradition. Thank you.